achieved so far in the UK. I take a more optimistic approach in terms of what we've been able to do in the UK in terms of driving down emissions and growing the economy at the same time. I think in particular, I think his critique of territorial emissions, the fact that we focus exclusively on those and we don't look at consumption-based emissions, the emissions in the products that we import from abroad, I think that's a very fair criticism. I think we should do much more to measure our consumption-based emissions and indeed to reflect our climate policies in our trade policies as well, to make sure that we're not just offshoring. But I think the evidence so far from the UK is that the vast majority of our emissions reductions have come from the power sector. It's come from the fact that coal, which was about a third of our energy mix in around 2012, is now something like 1 or 2%, and that's been replaced by a lot of natural gas and indeed a massive expansion in renewables, particularly offshore wind. And the UK has the second biggest fleet of offshore wind turbines in the world after China. So that, rather than deindustrialization, has been the main factor in the UK's impressive reduction in emissions. So, I think the other point that I think he was making, that we need to decarbonize in a way that is going to enable and encourage other countries, the ones that have rapidly growing economies, to also decarbonize. The UK has to show that we can grow our economy at the same time as reducing emissions. Otherwise, that is not a positive message that developing countries will want to emulate. So I think, lots of fair points in terms of how we should approach climate, but I think I'm more optimistic about what we've achieved so far in the UK, which I think has been a really good, strong success. Change requires long-term sustained action across multiple political cycles. Businesses need certainty that the policy frameworks are going to be put in place and remain in place, that they've got the confidence to invest in the technologies that we need to reach net zero. And at the same time, politicians have to worry about getting elected every few years as part of the electoral cycle, and that can cause tensions and conflicts. And in the UK, one of the ways in which we've tried to overcome this, and this is where I've got more time for targets than Sadita does, we came together in 2008, all main political parties in the UK, to agree the Climate Change Act, which set these series of 5-yearly carbon budgets and a long-term target. Then 80%, now it's been upgraded to net zero. And we had buy-in from all the political parties into that legislation. Only 5 MPs in the House of Commons voted against it. So there is that cross-party consensus. I think there should be a debate between political parties about how we get there. We shouldn't just, have a sort of unanimity on the best policy mechanisms. As a conservative, someone from the centre-right, I think we should have a much greater role for the private sector, for markets and free trade and getting us to net zero. People on the left of politics will take a much more big state, subsidy-driven approach, want to see public ownership of energy companies. And it's right that we have that debate and that we have those different approaches to get there, and that battle of ideas will hopefully mean that we get there in the most effective way. But no, I think we absolutely need buy-in on the end goal, the end destination, if we're going to see businesses and individuals have confidence in the ultimate direction of travel.
Yeah, the notion that politics is the problem. Well, yeah, it is the problem. Also, it is the solution, isn't it? I mean, the cleavages now we have in these debates is becoming so wide. On the one hand, we have the UN process, the COP formats. We have the dynamics happening in every individual member state. We have the groupings of countries in the EU, or the dynamics happening in the US. You also have a lot of pressure coming from climate activism and NGOs and so forth, which, of course, this is essential. But in a sense, we have a misalignment of the end goals. It's as if we keep the process going as it is, with all of these forces from everywhere. As Sir Digger Helm, by the way, said, we're not achieving the progress, and continuing pushing for targets just for target's sake is just not constructive. I'll give you an example. What will happen if we allow this debate to be dominated only by benign, climate activists? Take an example. What happened in Berlin a couple of weeks ago? There was a referendum that the capital of Germany should become climate neutral by 2030, which I think it's physically impossible. And this referendum failed because it didn't achieve the necessary votes. So it just gives you an example that even after decades of discussing this problem, yes, politics is part of the problem, but it seems as if we haven't even decided on the right avenue to approach this. So bottom line, politics is the solution, and I think that when it comes to groupings or coalitions, they will need to come from developed countries which decide that this sense of urgency is paramount. Climate club groupings, this idea has been discussed for a while now, and I think honestly, even though it's a Western-centric, of course, solution, but the idea of the EU, the UK, and the US, hopefully next couple of years, pushing something similar to a carbon border adjustment mechanism and trying to bring other countries on board through not only through diplomacy but through trade measures and additional carbon tax on the border for products. I think this is the way to go. Otherwise, we won't see tangible progress.
I think it's a mistake that the UK hasn't been quicker to come out with a full response to the Inflation Reduction Act, and there was some hope that the Powering Up Britain report might have had something in the way of a comprehensive response to the IRA, should we call it for short, and so it was disappointing. I thought that wasn't in there. I think Minister's response has been to say, well, the UK's got a head start already on lots of countries. We've got one of the best decarbonisation rates in the G20 over the last couple of decades. We've got this world-leading offshore wind sector. As other countries are catching up with us. And look, of course, I think we're going to continue to be able to attract investment into new renewables projects, into electric vehicles through some of the mechanisms we've already talked about, like contracts for difference or the zero emission vehicle mandates. But I think what worries me most about the Inflation Reduction Act's impact on the UK's green economy is what it means for our push to try and secure new jobs and industry off the back of the net zero transition. And I think we've got a really critical window now in the next few years when all these supply chains are scaling up to meet these new ambitious targets for renewable energy deployment, for electric car deployment, and companies are deciding where to build those factories and where to base that supply chain. And at the moment, all the incentives, all the carrots are on the American side of the Atlantic, and Britain, whilst it has this strong start in terms of rolling out these technologies, in terms of the investment environment, it's just not as competitive. And I think that's the missed opportunity. And I worry about what this means for the government's levelling up plan. There's a plan to lift up economic opportunities across the UK, including in particular in our industrial heartlands, places like Teesside in the northeast of England, which have been earmarked for getting lots of this net zero investment. That now some of those factories might not be based in the UK because it is just not as attractive compared to the US. And I think that's kind of what worries me. And sure, we might get cheaper goods, let American taxpayers subsidize these technologies and we buy them, and it might be better for the consumer. But in terms of, I think, industrial strategy and getting jobs to replace the ones we're going to lose in oil and gas and diesel manufacturing, I think there's a risk there. And the other thing that's slightly disappointing about the UK response is the sort of almost criticising the US for doing this, when we've been as a leader on climate change calling for the US to step up on climate, to do much more. They're the second biggest emitter in the world, and they have not until now passed major climate change legislation. So I think it's a really good thing that the US is now finally acting.
First of all, let's start from the fact that the whole 1.5 degrees, we've missed the train. So first we need to start with a very honest discussion on the fact that we will not achieve this target. We need to, become more and more aware that potentially by the end of the century, we'll see a world between 2 and 3 degrees in terms of increased temperatures. And this means not having more ambitious goals to reach the 1.5% target, which is clearly not working. This was referenced, by the way, in the video. You cannot expect to achieve progress if you just continue pushing the targets down the line, saying, by 2040, the developed world should contribute more. No. First, so we need to have this honest conversation that we've missed this train. So let's make sure that we manage the fallout. Climate adaptation, absolutely. Sam was absolutely correct that this is portrayed by certain circles as being defeatist or something like this. Well, look at the Netherlands or look at the state of Florida. What was supposed to happen to these geographical regions if they did not invest in climate adaptation? When you go to the region of Zeeland in the Netherlands, where floods decimated the area and flooded, I think, 1/4 of the territory of the Netherlands in the 50s and 60s, basically these people mobilized and built one of the most advanced installations for the time, which right now are giving them huge dividends. Same with Florida, same as other parts of the world, which there's rigorous science and estimates that the money you invest in climate adaptation, especially in the developing world as well, this brings you an immense effect, and this saves lives and makes sure that these economies will prosper. Instead of waiting for the rest of the world, to chip in and to slash their carbon footprint. I mean, good luck. If you are in a coastal region, good luck waiting for 20 years for somebody else to pick up the tab, instead of investing in your own climate adaptation efforts. So this is key. I also really think that we are operating in an environment where the resources are limited. Going through plans for decarbonization in Europe, in Britain, in the US, you kind of get the sense that we really want to do a bit of everything. And I think that for serious policymakers and people involved with the technical side of things, even though nobody's going to say it out loud, they're aware that we don't have the money for all of these measures. So I think if I were to be a policymaker, you need to make sure to mobilize these funds and get a bigger bang for your buck.